Powered by Dr. Podcast, your audio factory, turning ideas into a signature sound.
We have the privilege to have with us a very distinguished doctor, professor, neurologist, and a specialist of the stroke medicine, neuroprotection, and so on and so forth. It is Alastair Buchan. Professor, good morning.
Good morning.
You have so many titles and you did so many things in your life.
There's only one.
Let's start by medicine, right?
There's only one title, and that's doctor.
Doctor. But you have been a specialist of neurologist, and what I read is that you are working, or you worked very hard on neuroprotection. Mm-hmm. So can you explain simply what does it mean? What is this branch of medicine that you wish you dedicated your life and your work?
So I'm a neurologist. So my field is the brain, and protecting the brain and keeping the brain healthy is the job of a clinical neurologist. But my science is about how to understand how to keep brain cells alive when they are threatened. And the reason that that's important is obviously in stroke, there's a very acute energy crisis. You lose the blood flow to the brain. And when I was growing up, we were taught that once a blood vessel to the brain was blocked, that was it. We were taught that the brain would be fixed, immutable. If you lost the blood flow, the cells would die. If you tried to unblock the blockage, you would get a hemorrhage and you would kill the patient. And essentially, there was no treatment for stroke. And in fact, there was very little treatment in neurology at all. We had, obviously, the result of ventilation, the ability to keep people's body alive after they had a cardiac arrest, which became the field of transplantation. And so when I was growing up...
Transplantation of the heart.
Yes, you could. Christian Barnard, when I was at school, did a heart transplant, taking a dead patient's heart, but the patient had been kept on a ventilator to keep the heart healthy to give to the recipient. So the brain of the donor was essentially thought to be dead. There was nothing that
you cannot replace the brain.
You cannot replace the brain. You cannot transplant the brain. You can regenerate the brain, and I'll come to that a little bit. But essentially, our brain is what we gain in utero when we are in our mother's womb, and the brain is forming rapidly at the time we are born. And once the brain cells and the connections are formed, we were taught when I was a medical student that that was it. It was fixed. And if anything happened and you lost it, that was it. And actually, none of that's true.
Before saying why it's not true, we all understand and know that everyone dies because the heart stops to beat, right? I mean, right. It's heart attack or not heart attack when they say he died because of his heart stopped to beat. So that, whatever illness you
have. Not
have,
always true. If you go and you watch King Lear, and you watch King Lear over Cordelia, and he holds a feather to see if she stopped breathing. So before they understood about the heart, it was when you stopped breathing. We got past that, and when the heart stopped, it was felt there was nothing you could do. During the war, when young soldiers had their chests ripped open in North Africa, the surgeons were taught in their medical school that to operate on the heart was a crime against God. And so they operated on the heart, because these young people had nothing to lose, and they figured out they could take a patient whose heart had been damaged by shrapnel or a bullet in the desert. They could stop the heart, suture it up, restart the heart, and save a life. So in the 1940s, it became possible to resuscitate and to restart the heart. And that was a complete change then in understanding what was death, because your heart could stop, you were dead, the heart could be restarted, you were resuscitated.
That's very interesting. But the question I wanted to ask you is, what is the brain? What is the function of the brain in a human life, in a human body?
I just will finish by saying that what we discovered was actually when the brain cells are discharged, they're like little batteries, and when they lose their energy and they go flat, you stop being you. You stop being the human that you are. It might be mechanical. You can't lift an arm if the left side of your brain goes flat. You might not be able to speak, or you might not be able to understand, or you might not be able to remember.
But you're still able to live.
You're
like
still able to
vegetable.
live. So after a stroke, you lose a bit of brain tissue. But when the heart stops, you lose all the brain tissue. And so you become brain dead if the heart is not restarted within 10, 15, 20 minutes. Young people can solve the threat more easily than older people. But what was discovered in the desert was that you could restart the heart and the brain could be normal. And that was transformational.
So, the gap in which the heart was not functioning, and
10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So you asked about the brain. The brain is the essence of humanity. It is how we see, how we hear music, how we see pictures, how we think, how we create, how we remember, how we develop our personality. And actually, memory is to be human. And the tragedy of our world is the disease of dementia, when you lose the ability to remember. And so neuroprotection is the desperate need to find a way to stop brain cells dying, particularly those that conserve memory. How do you look after the single biggest threat to a human being, which is their personality, their memory, their ability, of course, to look after themselves, but beyond the physiology and the day-to-day living, it's about how you preserve intelligence, cognitive abilities, creativity, and the ability to share humanity with other humans.
So they found ways. You were talking about the heart. I'm sorry to mix things, but they found ways. We know which are many of the causes of a heart problem, including high blood pressure. So there are medicines who put the pressure to normality. Then you can have a diet, right? Because the cholesterol is dangerous for the heart. There are some kind of preventions. Nevertheless, people die as well. But what kind of neuroprotection you can do against what you said, dementia, Alzheimer, or even the tumor eventually?
So I went from being a young student at Cambridge to doing a research degree at Cambridge, where I was taught that if you damaged the brain, it couldn't repair itself. Mm-hmm. And I made lesions of a pathway to try and trace how connections worked. And if I looked after a few days, I could see the connection had been disconnected, and I could trace the way the fibers had gone from one part of the brain to another part of the brain. But if I waited 3 weeks, I couldn't see that disconnection. The brain had repaired itself. So the first thing I was taught is that the brain was fixed, immutable. It's not. It's plastic. The second thing I was taught is you couldn't restart the brain by resuscitating the heart. That was not true. And taking blood clots out, we were told never to do that again. We've discovered that that's not true. So we're catching up with cardiology. We're learning that the heart is able to recover. We're learning that you can perfuse the brain, as you do in the heart with stents to get the blood flow back to the heart. We now use stents for the brain. We use thrombolytics to dissolve the blood clots that block the flow of energy to the brain and recover the patient. First patients I treated, they would come in with a stroke. They couldn't speak, paralyzed down one side. For 20 years, I had seen these people come and become bedridden and be damaged. We gave these thrombolytics. And within an hour, we saw something we'd never seen before. The patient would start to speak. The patient would start to lift their hand. And the blood flow we could monitor. We could see the blood flow had been restored. Not only had the blood flow been restored, but the cells that controlled speech and movement were functioning again. But it was no longer possible to be the neurologist that we were taught to be, where we spent hours, sometimes many hours, diagnosing the location and the anatomy and the space of where the brain was being damaged. We actually had to treat the patient in 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. So we didn't have time to examine the patient in a very precise way, we had to identify essentially there was a blocked vessel, that there was a deficit, and that if we gave a treatment and unblocked the vessel, we would get recovery of the deficit. So neurology flipped from being all about space and location to being about time. And that's what cardiology did before us. Cardiology in the desert, cardiology in the cardiac units where people were resuscitated, cardiology in the operating room was all about time. And so my big change in my life as a neurologist has been about how we move from diagnosis and precision to speed and understanding what I call a brain-time continuum. And that the timing of what we do is critical. If you lose all blood flow, you have 5, 10, 15 minutes. If you block a vessel, you have 1, 2, 3 hours. And this has made neurology like cardiology.
Nowadays, since a long time, people do checkups, right? Checkups with blood tests and so forth, which doesn't impede the heart attack, because maybe you do all the thing, your heart is good, and then you die 2 minutes after. But is there a regular checkup on the brain, that you can know if the stroke is coming or not coming?
Actually, it's a bit like having a heart monitor. If we are with people and we are talking and we are engaging with people, we are being monitored. The brain is monitoring its function exquisitely when it is active. When you are asleep, or when you are dozing off watching the TV, or when you are under anesthesia and the brain is not active, it is not being monitored. So the answer to your question, which I'd like to come back to in a short period of time, is that brain activity, because it requires all kinds of drawing on memory, vision, speech, movement, you are essentially monitoring your own brain all the time.
So when they say that one cures himself from dementia, for instance, by having many interests, by reading, by keep on working, by trying to solve problems, it is true.
I believe that's absolutely true. But one thing I wanted to mention is that one of the things I discovered was that when we had a cardiac arrest in an animal model, we resuscitated and got the brain working again, we wanted to protect the cells if we went 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And what we discovered was that if we dropped the temperature just 2-3 degrees and put the brain literally on ice, 2 or 3 degrees, only 2 or 3 degrees, we could get incredible protection. And the important thing was, in answer to your question about is it possible to protect, we could do this 3 to 6 to 9 hours after we had resuscitated the brain. We could drop the temperature by 2 or 3 degrees for maybe 24 hours and prevent the injury that matures very slowly. So dropping temperature is a way of protecting the brain even after the insult. So it's possible, but we don't have any drugs. We have no drugs that will do what hypothermia will do. And what I've been working on for 30 years more is trying to find a way to effect what we do with low temperature, hypothermia, to get a drug, a small molecule that will actually create the same protection. And if we can do that in stroke, then the question will be, if it works acutely in that car crash of a stroke, could it be given very, very gently over years to prevent dementia?
So can I take a pill? Can a person who is regularly taking a pill to control his blood pressure, right? So every day you take at X hour this pill and it does protect you, right? Or you take a statin.
Yeah, so in cardiology, we've learned to treat people with lowering the blood pressure, giving statins, and giving aspirin to stop embolic events.
And this helps the brain, or it doesn't?
Lowering the blood pressure is good for the brain. It keeps the blood vessels healthy. So it's important to stop the brain blood vessels. We used to say they got stiff with age. If you lower the blood pressure, the brain blood vessels, the so-called neurovascular unit, is healthy. Interestingly, the statins, which stop you dying and stop you having heart attacks, don't stop you getting dementia. And that's been a really big disappointment. And I've never understood why in the heart protection studies we haven't had brain protection. But we
talk a lot about dementia. There are two things, dementia and Alzheimer, which is another kind of illness. Doctors say that they are confident that in a certain number of years, the vast majority of cancers will be treated, possibly treated, because they're improving the chemotherapy, they're improving the research and so on. But the same people say it won't be so easy to cure the Alzheimer or the dementia. Well, this is much more difficult, and we are not sure that we will be able to do it.
So the problem is we don't understand the cause of the disease. In stroke and in heart attack, we know the cause. You have a blocked blood vessel, you lose oxygen, glucose, and metabolism. And unless you unblock the vessel, the tissue will die. It needs oxygen and glucose. In Alzheimer's, we don't know what causes it.
We don't know what it is.
We don't know what causes it.
Isn't it, there are many more cases of heart attack in young age and then dementia or Alzheimer in young age. Isn't it a normal thing for a normal person to have dementia? I mean, to lose a bit of your memory, to remember the past, but not remembering what happened 2 minutes before. Isn't it part of the process of aging?
We're all on a spectrum. Some people get to 100, 105 with no cancer, no vascular disease, no dementia. And some people sadly get cancers in their 20s and 30s and 40s. People get heart attacks in their 40s or 50s. We've learned to stop people smoking. We've learned to control the blood pressure. We've learned to control the cholesterol. Some of that's helpful with stroke, but the evidence that it prevents dementia is still not clear. Two types of dementia. One is so-called Alzheimer's, where you see a lot of protein called amyloid deposited in the brain. I think that's the waste product. I don't think it's the cause. I think it's the result of the brain tissue being damaged. But getting the amyloid out looks like it might be helpful, but it may not prevent the disease. It might improve. The second thing is you can get vascular dementia, which is like mini strokes when the neurovascular units get blocked. And I think with the right treatments, that's more likely to result in...
And what are these treatments?
Again, very simple: controlling blood pressure, keeping the blood clean, keeping the statins, keeping the cholesterol down, using antiplatelet agents to stop blockages, and possibly changing the inflammation in the body as we get older.
How do you change the inflammation?
Well, by being healthy. Diet, exercise, and if there's a reason for the inflammation, like arthritis or something, controlling the inflammation with anti-inflammatory drugs. So inflammation is something that creeps up on everybody. People get arthritis, people get skin rashes, people get inflammation in their blood vessels. Controlling inflammation may buy more time, may reduce the risk of ill health, particularly as it affects the brain.
Now, it will seem to you a strange question. I talk about dementia, your specialty. Aren't we living too long? Somebody said that the human being is programmed in nature to live for a certain number of years, and the fact that we live so long is only due to medicine or to some conditions.
No. If you go back to the Bible, people live to their 100, 110. The problem used to be that people were dying in childbirth, people were dying of infectious disease, so they weren't getting to 7 or 10 or 20, they weren't getting to middle age. And the reality is that the people that weren't dying in childbirth, weren't dying of infection, weren't dying of starvation or pandemics, were being selected. Many of them would live for a very long time. And this is recorded in the Bible. And so it is possible to live to 100, 110 and to be perfectly healthy and perfectly intelligent. But the risk is, as we get older, inflammation will damage the vessels, will damage the brain, will lead to poor health. So the only point in living, as you say, to excessive age is if you live to healthy.
But is it excessive or not? I don't know. It's just
So let me come back to time. Actually, it's something that I'm thinking very hard about, and something happened that's really, really interesting. So for 30 years, I've been treating patients with stroke and giving a clot remover or giving a thrombolytic, getting the blood flow back and seeing fantastic results. But it turns out that the brain activity is critical. So the brain in the morning, as we are speaking now, when the brain is engaged and active, is much easier to treat than the brain after dinner in the evening going into the night.
Much easier.
Much easier when your brain is active. Your brain being active is really quite protected. The blood vessels work better. The neurovascular unit is more active. And when you lose blood flow because of a blocked blood vessel for a clot or causing a stroke, it's much better when you pull the clot out, you get much better results. Turns out that in the evening and at night, time is different. It's a bit like sort of Einstein and relativity. My brain time continuum gets bent depending on the hour of the day. And there's a circadian effect, which we're just beginning to explore, in which the brain at night has a different brain time continuum to a brain first thing in the morning.
If you work at night?
So if you work at night, you probably will have protection. The worst thing you can do is I don't in any way draw any kind of the Islamic Ramadan, to starve yourself all day and then to eat massively in the evening and going to bed. This is a risky experiment.
I see.
What we discovered was in our animals, when we gave them neuroprotective drugs in the morning, when the animals were asleep, they were getting very big strokes. And when we gave them these drugs that we thought might work, the strokes were smaller. But when we gave the same drugs to the humans in the morning, made no difference. The drugs didn't work. The point being that the animals in the morning are asleep. They're nocturnal. They're active at night. So we went back and we gave the drugs to the animals at night when they were busy running around. Drugs didn't work. So the drugs are working when the brain is inactive.
So, doctor, should we sleep less? I mean, how much do we have to sleep in order to keep a healthy brain?
We need to sleep in such a way that our physiology is optimized. So we need to go to bed at quite a regular time. We need to avoid eating late and having a big glucose surge before we go to sleep. So we should eat a bigger meal at lunchtime, and we should be more careful with dinner. We need to have sleep that's quite regulated. The windows probably need to be open to lower the temperature by 1 or 2 degrees. And we need to be very dark. Light is really toxic to the brain at night because it opens up.
At night when you sleep?
Even if you get up at night, you need low blue lighting or low red lighting. Red lighting would be best. You do not want bright lights at night. You do not want to be looking at a screen at night. So the hygiene, the circadian or diurnal hygiene is becoming really quite interesting. So I think that the active brain, and this is really fascinating, the active brain is much better at protecting itself. So I'm now starting a trial in my stroke unit with the patients, because when I used to treat patients as a more junior doctor, I would spend 6-8 hours with them during the infusion and during the bolus and during the first 6 to 8 hours. I would stay at the bedside. And I would force them to talk to me. I'd force them to lift up their arms. I would force them to interact with their families. And actually, I was very worried by the patients at night. You give a treatment, they go to sleep, you come in the next day, treatment hadn't worked. So I now want to do a trial whereby, whether it's in the day or at night, the families and the physios and the OTs keep the patient really active for that first 3 to 6 hours that is critical. Because I don't have a drug and I don't have an explanation.
What do you mean 3 to 6 hours?
During the reperfusion of the brain.
But then you don't sleep.
Doesn't matter for 6 hours. This is during a stroke. This is just during the stroke.
Oh, I see.
During the stroke, I don't like people having an anesthesia. I don't like them having sedative drugs. A lot of the neuroprotective drugs that looked like they might work in the animals were actually sedative. They were blocking the channels of the brain and stopping people thinking. And I think that does more harm than good.
Many people take the several things. Nowadays, first of all, people spend half of their life in front of a screen, right? Looking at internet or blogs or Instagram or movies or working, they spend hours and hours and hours in front of a screen. Is that bad for the brain?
I personally think the healthiest thing to do is to be sufficiently, I suppose, disciplined to make the evening a very healthy evening and to maybe write a diary and to read on paper with proper illumination. I really worry that social media, all of the information overload coming through the internet on screens is actually possibly not allowing the brain to prepare for a proper circadian rhythm. I think the screens and the interaction first thing in the morning is fine. I think in the evening, you need a period of transition, and we need to understand.
And the same is for television.
Yeah.
Not watch television before
I think it's nice to go to the theatre and the opera. And in the old days, probably better to go home and not to go to the after dinner, after the opera. Best to have your meal in between the acts, but not after the acts.
To never have meals too late.
No, I think the best way to do opera is to have your meal in between the first half and the second half.
The people who don't go to the opera.
They should avoid eating late in the evening. And if their life is so busy, then as we do in Oxford, we provide all the staff and all of the fellows with a very big lunch. And that's their main meal of the day.
And what about breakfast?
Breakfast is important.
There are people who have breakfast, many large breakfasts or less large breakfasts, depends on the country. And there are people who don't have breakfast. They just drink coffee.
So I have to qualify everything because there are larks and there are owls. And I'm a lark, so I'm up at 4 o'clock, 3:30, 4 in the morning, and I do most of my creative thinking between 4 and 6. And then I will have coffee and breakfast. I'll have coffee at 3:30, 4 too, but I will eat at maybe 6, 7 o'clock. But people who are owls work into the night. They work maybe 11, 12, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and then they go to sleep. And then they don't get active till maybe 8, 9, 10 o'clock. So everything I say has to be couched in terms of recognizing people's chronotype. Are they owls or are they larks? And they're different.
What time you go to bed?
I go to bed 9, 10.
Yeah, most people go to bed around midnight.
And they get up at 7, 8. Yes.
Right?
And then there are the people who work into the night and go to sleep at 2, 3.
Right. But is breakfast a necessity?
Depends what you do. I think if you exercise first thing in the morning, it's probably very important to eat after the exercise.
If you don't exercise?
Then you don't need to eat so much. This whole business of health and protecting the brain, I think comes back to physiology, stopping the brain becoming too overloaded with glucose, stopping the brain getting hot, particularly if you have a fever or if the environment is too hot.
Is there more brain damage in people who live in the northern countries or in people in the southern countries? Because, for instance, let's take an example. A country like Spain, people eat very late at night.
Yes.
And they still wake up not so late in the morning.
Right. But they also
instead in parts of America,
they also eat at lunchtime and have a siesta.
Yes. And this is good.
I don't think it's very good. No. I think eating and going to sleep is not the best combination. I think being active and then eating and then being active before you prepare for sleep is better. In the north, people in Scotland
eat very early. You have dinner at 6 o'clock.
Old people tend to eat earlier. As people get older, they tend to eat at 6, 7.
And that's good?
I think so, yes.
It is.
Particularly if they stay up a bit, yes.
And some other people say, I drink a whiskey because it's good for the blood.
Yes.
Is it true?
If it's Scotland, you drink a whiskey and you open the window before you go to bed. It's cold. Dropping the temperature at night.
No, but I mean alcohol, because nowadays
but the alcohol
is alcohol.
Alcohol is.
Then I put 3 things together: alcohol, tranquilizers, sleeping pills. Are these damaging the brain?
I don't like sedation. Alcohol is okay because it vasodilates. It dilates the blood vessel. It dilates the neurovascular unit. So it's healthy for the brain.
So 1 whiskey or
2 whiskeys. Right? Yeah. A little bit of whiskey at night will help.
I said whiskey, but nowadays tequila is vodka.
Well, you need to be careful. I mean,
whatever.
Tequila has psychedelic drug in it. A single malt whiskey is pretty, and some wine with dinner, I think, is fine. But people who take sedative drugs, I think, risk two things. You risk being less interactive, and therefore the brain is...
So by sedative drugs, you mean Valiums or
yes,
things like this?
And I worry that you drop the oxygen to the brain as well. So it's to do with oxygen, glucose, light. We have to get the physiology right. During the day, when we're interacting, it's possible to monitor the brain because we're using it. At night, we have no monitor for the brain.
But what is strange is that many people, now that people take melatonin or they take other things, because they are afraid not to fall asleep, right? And it happens to all of us, I imagine, that there are many nights you want to fall asleep, but you think to something, then this something brings you to something else, and then you start worrying.
Yes,
that you
so
will not have enough sleep.
So this is why the hygiene is important. How your day finishes, you have dinner, you have some time to listen to music, to relax, you maybe write a diary. You need to have that rhythmicity. If you suddenly, open a letter from a lawyer or you look at your tax return at 10 o'clock at night, this is not a good thing to do. So you need to avoid stresses that are predictable late. And people in Europe would never answer the telephone after 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night. All my life, my parents, if the phone went after 9 o'clock at night, we did not.
Were your parents Germans?
No, they were from the UK. And I brought you some...
You were born in Germany.
Yeah,
right?
I brought you this. This for you. This is about my... So we published it last month. And the first chapter, they essentially grew up in the Northeast during the war. And after the war, my father was a doctor, my mother was a teacher. And because my father had to do national service, we were sent in that aftermath my father to be a doctor in the Royal Army Medical Corps of the British Army of the Rhine. So I was born in Germany.
Is NHS, the English public health, as bad as they describe it?
Now, yes. To my absolute sadness, the NHS has ceased to be a service. It's become a provider, a purchaser. It's no longer providing a service. So what used to be the National Health Service has become National Health England. And National Health England is not providing a service. It's purchasing service. And they can't provide people who need the care they need for disease, cancer, rheumatology, vascular disease, neurological disease, are not getting the care they need because the services, the hospitals, and all completely overloaded with providing social care for the elderly who are not being properly supported in the community. So what was the whole point of providing medical care and surgical care has been displaced by the fact that they're using all the resources of what was the National Health Service to look after a community that's no longer being looked after in the community by the families, by the local councils.
You have recently faced, everybody else who's still alive, the pandemia of COVID, right?
Yes.
Which was probably, for most of us, the first great pandemia that happened all over the world. And do you think that it has been treated properly? Because we see all the time, there is in Congo a new thing that is dangerous, they say, for children. There is in China something else. And viruses are everywhere. And there are the vaccines, right?
Yeah.
That people should do or not do. Vaccine for the flu, vaccine for the whatever. What do you think about all that?
Actually, a bigger pandemic in my lifetime was HIV.
Oh, yes, of course.
And so when I was a young doctor, we started to see cases with very strange infections in the brain, strange skin infections. People, including people I knew, were getting ill in a way that we didn't understand. And it was thought to be because they were gay. And it was an act of God. And it took maybe a year, maybe 2 years to understand that this was a virus that was essentially discovered in Paris, and HIV was defined as the cause of what was called AIDS. And that has yet to lead to a really effective vaccine. It's led to retroviral treatment, and people are now being kept alive in the same way that insulin stops people dying from diabetes. But there is no vaccine for HIV. My real worry with COVID is that we were all looking to see an influenza epidemic. And what it was a corona epidemic. Corona is like the common cold. And my suspicion is that the corona COVID epidemic was really fatal for very elderly people, but the government's got into a panic. And there's going to be a very, very difficult analysis of what was really necessary and whether the lockdowns did more harm than good. What happened to the NHS is that it stopped the provision of care for heart attacks, cancer, all of the diseases that needed to be taken care of. And after 2 or 3 years, there's now a complete tsunami of people with disease that hadn't been taken care of in the 2020, 21, 22 during those pandemic and the recovery from pandemic years. The amazing success of discovering the virus very quickly took years for AIDS, it took months for COVID, was phenomenal. Getting a vaccine developed, particularly with the mRNA, has been revolutionary because now the mRNA vaccines are very easy to dial up, and they're being dialed up as vaccines for cancer. And who knows, there could be a vaccine for dementia if we understand the cause. We understand the proteinaceous cause of a cancer or a proteinaceous cause of a neurological disease. I can imagine that an mRNA could be designed as a vaccine very quickly. What happened in COVID, though, was that I think the infection spread really very rapidly, and the vaccines looked very good, but in fact, an awful lot of people had developed immunity by the time the vaccines came around, which is not to say that the vaccines didn't help prevent people getting really ill. But what they didn't do ever was to stop people getting the disease. And so the COVID vaccines, while really important, unlike a vaccine that we need for HIV, do not stop you getting the disease. And if I came to you and said, I've got a vaccine for HIV, it won't stop you getting HIV, but it might stop you dying. Will you take it? You wouldn't. Well,
I would take it.
What you want is a vaccine that stops you getting a disease. Everybody who's been vaccinated for COVID is still getting COVID.
But people who are vaccinated for the flu
still get the flu.
So it's irrelevant.
It may reduce the severity of the illness, but we haven't figured out how to make true vaccines, as we did for polio and for smallpox, to try to actually stop the disease infecting people. And that's what a vaccine needs to do. And so then the question is, the discovery, and the big discovery from COVID is that you can make an mRNA vaccine. You can literally type in the protein and make an antibody from an mRNA that will stop you getting sick with COVID. Really good. Can you type in a tumor antigen from a cancer, type it in, and prevent the tumor? And cancer is really interesting. And it comes back to my thinking about neurology. I think cancer is to do with cells being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I've had esophageal cancer, and esophageal cancer is at the junction between the esophagus and the stomach. And what causes esophageal cancer is stomach cells being too high up and being in that border zone that actually is the esophagus. They don't live there. They are, if you like, refugees. They are, if you like, not belonging to that society. And they are in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they become like a terrorist cell. They become malignant. And I think if you look at breast cancer or uterine cancer or bladder cancer or prostate cancer, it's nearly always that the cells are on the wrong side of a border. So I think there's an analogy to how cancer develops, being cells not in their home tissue, which I think has got an interesting geographical, geopolitical analogy in the way in which people, on the Northern Irish border, the Berlin Wall, the North Korea, South Korea, now Ukraine, Gaza. If you're on the wrong side of a border, you are at risk of reacting badly to your hosts. And I think cancer is cells being on the wrong side of a border.
And you can prevent it?
Yes, by communication. We need to understand how the cells communicate, and we need to understand in cancer how to get the cells that are in the wrong location at the wrong time to actually adapt and become part of their new environment. We need to understand how cells are communicating. Same goes for the brain. The whole point of the brain, you asked me if you understand neurology, if you understand how the brain works. Actually, we don't really understand how neurons communicate. And it seems to me that to solve dementia, we're going to need to really understand how the brain cells are communicating with each other in order to understand when they go wrong and they stop communicating with each other. And that is dementia.
And in your long career, did you see a lot of progress?
In dementia?
No, in the brain. Yeah, I mean, in the brain prevention, in the brain.
In growing up in neurology, the only things we could do when I graduated was to stop epilepsy, the sacred disease of the ancient Greeks, with anticonvulsants. Magical. We could give a shot of an anticonvulsant and stop a seizure. That was unbelievable. We could give to pregnant women who got low magnesium and were having seizures with eclampsia, give magnesium. We could treat infection. We could treat meningitis, tuberculous meningitis, or bacterial meningitis with antibiotics. If somebody came in polio-like with Guillain-Barré, we could put them on a ventilator and keep them alive. We had no treatments for stroke, none. I worked at the Montreal Neurological Institute, which was built by Wilder Penfield, a brain surgeon. And there was a rule in the 1960s and the 1970s, no stroke, because they had no treatment and they didn't want the beds filled with stroke patients. Now, stroke is the number one treatable disease in neurology. It's got extraordinary effectiveness if we can get the patients in early, diagnose them quickly, unblock the blockage and get the oxygen and glucose back. And we now need to make stroke very much like cardiology, and we need to move on and take the lessons from cardiology, who are now concentrating on heart failure, to starting to learn how to work on brain failure, which is dementia.
For more than 10 years, or almost 10 years, you have been Dean of Medicine at the University of Oxford, right? Which means what ahead of all the medicine is the medicine good at the University of Oxford compared to NHS, or is that the same?
So the University of Oxford, and this is a very interesting question. I worked in Canada for 20 years, where the hospitals and the universities were very, very, very integrated, as they are in Holland, as they are in Germany. And if you go back to the 1880s, the Charité in Berlin, or you go to the Amsterdam, or you go to the big hospitals in the United States at Johns Hopkins or Harvard Medical School at the Massachusetts General Hospital, the integration of the university and the hospital is absolutely tight.
And that's important?
It's extremely important. So the problem is that in the UK, the universities developed separately from the NHS. In the old days, when you went to university at Oxford or Cambridge, you then went to medical school at the London hospitals, Guy's Hospital, the Middlesex, St George's, Charing Cross, the Westminster, the London. Your university was Oxford, Cambridge, or a London university, and then you went to medical school in the hospital. Now you go to university for medical school and they partner with the hospital. But the hospital runs the hospital and the university runs the university. And I think that Berlin Wall style, is a disaster.
What were you running as a dean of
I was running the university.
And not the hospital.
And I tried very hard for 10 years to integrate Canadian style, Berlin style, so that my head of neurology, my head of surgery, my head of cancer, my head of pediatrics was also the head in the hospital of surgery, medicine, pediatrics, obstetrics, and gynecology. And my model was to integrate the leadership of the department in the university so that the department of the university and the department of the hospital was one and the same. The University of Oxford as a medical school is as good as anywhere in the world. The hospital is not.
You studied in Cambridge.
I went from school to Cambridge.
Not to Oxford.
I came to Oxford for medical school, and I went to Harvard for my initial neurology training, and then I went to Cornell for my neurological training in New York Hospital for stroke.
Because America is
integrated.
Avant-garde, the better medicine than it is in Europe? Or
Nope. In the best places, it's more aggressive and there's more resources. In the worst places, it's unavailable. But if you want the absolute best possible care, and I've looked after very important people with a lot of money, I would tell them what the problem is, and I would advise them if they want to spend money to get exceptional care, you go to the Mayo Clinic, you go to the MD Anderson, you go to Sloan Kettering. In the UK now, you will go to the specialty hospitals in London. They're very good, but they're not running in the same way that the National Health Service is running. So in London, you have the specialty hospitals. They were built near the railway stations, near King's Cross, near Euston, near St Pancras. So people would come from all over the country to have their neurological diagnosis, their cancer diagnosis at the Marsden, which is fine if you've got a few weeks or a few months, but it's not fine if you've got 20 minutes. My point being that the National Health Service hospitals were not set up in a way that's integrated with the universities, whereas in the US, the best hospitals are integrated with the university. Well, medicine at Oxford in the university is exceptional, it's fantastic, but the hospital gets the benefit of the university, but it doesn't let the university run the hospital. And I think that is a pity.
You now spend some of your time in Germany, in Berlin, because you created an Oxford Unity in Berlin, which is obviously linked to the main university. Why did you do that? And what it is the necessity of that? I mean, why did you do that?
So I lived through my deanship years during austerity, when the money was threatened. And the result of the money being threatened was that the people who wanted to take political control in this country away from David Cameron and George Osborne, who was the architect of austerity, they, to try to get what John Major, the Prime Minister years ago after Margaret Thatcher, called the bastards, under control over being Eurosceptic, was to give them a referendum. And it never occurred to them, having won the referendum in Scotland, no independence for Scotland, they thought there would be pushback against Brexit, and they got the wrong result. They got the wrong result because the population was lied to by the Brexiteers, the people that were leavers. And we, the Remainers, we were victims, which is a difficult expression to use, but we felt that we were going to lose a lot. In Oxford, about 30 to 40% of the students were coming from Europe. Some of the best students came from Germany. You were more likely to get a first-class degree in Oxford if you came from a German high school than if you came from Eton or Winchester or St. Paul's. The students were exceptional. We had maybe 30, 40% of our academic researchers bringing European money to Oxford. Oxford didn't win the European money. Oxford was attractive to European scholars who got European research funding, which made them mobile. We had maybe 30% of our doctors in the hospital who were trained in Europe, were exceptional. They came to Oxford because it's a big university, exciting place to be. The nurses, the support staff, a lot of Europeans. After Brexit, they left. And Oxford, all of a sudden, becomes a university in the Thames Valley. Well, Oxford is a global university. It's a European university. It's been a European university since it was founded 900 years ago. And I went to the House of Commons as the representative for the university, and I got myself and probably the university into some difficulty, and I went off script when they challenged me and said, well, why was Brexit not good for Oxford? We would be able to get students from all over the world. And I said, because we are a European university, and the truth of the matter is that the one thing you don't do in a university is to put up a wall. Bologna, the first European university, was founded on the principle of national borders being open to scholars and students and ideas. And the Bologna Charter was about allowing students from all over Europe to come to Bologna. Well, Oxford has allowed all the students originally in Oxford came from Europe. They came from the Low Countries. Oxford, I said to the House of Commons, is like, it is completely integrated. And it would be like telling Manchester United that they couldn't play football in Europe. It's a Manchester United issue. We're a premier university, a premier team. And if you said to the manager of Manchester United, you have to have Manchester players, you have to have Manchester fans, Manchester money, and you have to play in England, it would not be Manchester United. Oxford has students from all over the world, has academics from all over the world, the money comes from all over the world, and we collaborate. integrated research in networks all over the world. Brexit defies the Bologna Charter. It's a disaster. And there was a big row. And they said, no, by walling Oxford off, it would become much better for people in the UK. And I said, and so you would wall off Stratford-upon-Avon, and you wouldn't let actors and you wouldn't let visitors come to Stratford. You'd make it English. And so we got into a fight where I said that the University of Oxford only survives in the global way that it does, along with Harvard, Stanford, and in Europe. The most important universities in Europe actually are in Israel, ETH, in Switzerland, Tel Aviv, Weizmann in Israel, Lausanne in Switzerland. The Charité is the leading hospital in Europe, Salpêtrière in Paris, the Sorbonne. You can put 10 leading teams, like a premier football team league, and Oxford is part of that. The only way I could protect Oxford was to open a European entity. So we created Oxford in Berlin, and I went to the mayor of Berlin, and I went to the universities in Berlin, and we established an open laboratory and office space in the Museum for Nature, and we funded it, and we had an open access so people could come and collaborate, and we had workshops, we had seminars, we had student mobility, and we tried to partner with not just the Charité, where I worked in Berlin, but with Humboldt University, with the Free University, and with the Technical University, which formed the Berlin University Alliance. And the paradox for me was that this was like the reverse of what happened in the 1930s, when people came from Berlin to Oxford, to Cambridge, on their way to Stanford, to Princeton, to California. We had the ability to open up, if you like, an open border between Oxford and Berlin. We couldn't do it with France or Germany, but we could do it with the mayor and the Senate and the Länder of Berlin, because they weren't regulated with Brussels. When I talked to the French government and I talked to Angela Merkel's government and the ambassador, they said, no, you're in England, you must talk to Brussels, you're in the middle of Brexit. But if we took it down a level to the Länder, the mayor of Berlin, open arms. And as a result, Cambridge partnered with Munich, LMU. The Frankfurt partnered with Birmingham. Dresden partnered with King's. And so we had...
The Imperial College is now so important.
Imperial partnered with Technical University Munich. And I created the model, if you like, the archetype.
So, but only with Germany?
Yes, because...
Not Italy, not Spain, not France,
because the universities and the hospitals are supported at a local level in Germany. If you go to France, it's all Napoleonic, it's federal. And INSERM, it's federal. All the funding, all of the hospitals, all of the universities report federally, and they say, go to Brussels. Same in Italy, same in Spain. In Germany, Munich can talk to Cambridge. Oxford can talk to Berlin. Dresden can talk to King's. There is no involvement of Angela Merkel or the Chancellery. And that is really interesting, because it then allowed us to do something very special, because in Berlin, Oxford got access to what it never got in London, to the museums, the Humboldt Forum with Neil MacGregor. He got access to the Pergamon. We were able to do music in the Philharmonie, in the Staatsopera.
How many students you have in Oxford and how many in Berlin?
So in 3 years, we had over 1,000 people working between Oxford and Berlin, people going backwards and forwards. And we had funding for workshops. We then got seed funding. And I had hoped that we would develop what I call a virtual college. The mayor of Berlin persuaded the culture, SPK, the Prussian Culture Ministry, to make Glinica Palace down by Glinica Bridge available so that we could use that. And I had managed 20 people, including myself, funded as fellows, and each fellow might have 10 students. And then virtual college, not a college sitting Broad Street and on the High Street in Oxford, but a college shared between Oxford and Berlin, where we might have 12 Oxford fellows, 12 Berlin fellows, and together we would share 100 students. And the college would be a modern university without borders, without restrictions on national borders, but critically, what we learned from COVID is that we can work on the internet, we can work with Zoom, we can work with Teams, we can teach, we can research, we can collaborate, we can investigate, we can write papers virtually, and that's new. And I think the future of universities is that they will be integrated transnationally in a way that we've never thought of before. And I was trying to see if Oxford, Berlin could create something really special. In the 1900s, before the First and Second War damage, Dahlem, where the Free University is, was known as Oxford in Berlin. I tried to reinvent that, not to help people leave Berlin during the Nazi oppression, but to help people from the UK come after Brexit with free access to European scholarship, funding, students, mobility.
And what makes, besides the human qualities and his intelligence, but what makes a good doctor? Because after all, the doctor is like the pilot of a plane, right? You go to a doctor and he can give you the wrong medicine or the right medicine to do the right operation or not.
The one thing you do not want when you get onto a plane and they say, fasten your seatbelts, is for the pilot to come on and say, I'm working from home today. Mm-hmm. And if the doctor is not seeing you in person, is only providing remote consultation, is not knowing you, the person. And William Osler, who was one of my, long dead, but he always used to say, it is not the patient that has a disease, it is the disease that has a patient. And it's really important that you become very knowledgeable about what the disease is doing to the patient. You can't do that through data. You can't do that with computerized
But that's what's
imaging.
Happening today.
It's not happening. The best doctors are the people who are very, very connected on a human level to the patient who is having a disease. Because
which are the best doctors? The American ones, the Indian ones?
The best surgeons are always the surgeons that don't operate because they say you don't need surgery. The best oncologists are always the oncologists say, no, you don't need that taking out. You don't need that chemotherapy. It's the doctor that actually is very, very critical of the arguments and sees through what the motives are. The doctor also has to be a good doctor, has to be very quick. If you need antibiotics for infection, he has to diagnose the infection quickly and give you the antibiotics. But the doctor who's preventing cancer or vascular disease or neurological disease has to be very careful that he understands what you need and what you don't need. And often the best doctors are the ones that provide secondary consultation and agree that you don't need the treatment that's being pushed by people who've got perhaps a motive to provide that treatment. The best doctor is the doctor who treats you like a student, and actually in the same way that my professors looked after me, even when I became a full professor in Oxford, my references were written by the professors 30 years after they taught me. They kept up with me for 30, 40 years. The best doctor is the family doctor that looks after you and your family for the whole of their career.
But all this is
halcyon, rose-tinted spectacles.
It's not what happens today.
No. But I do think that there's two sorts of medicine. There's the sort of medicine that you get from the hospital, that you get from the clinic, and there's a kind of concierge medicine, whereby there are people who actually are one step removed, who are actually providing advice, providing access, and are kicking the tires and checking things, not the primary practitioner. And I think
nowadays you said something interesting at the beginning about the importance of time and of timing in curing and so on and so forth. But today, people don't even have the time to have a flu. Illness is not conceivable. People were going to sanatoriums for months, or they were taking vacation. You had a flu, you had to recover, you went to convalescence. All this is forgotten. It's like you don't prepare the shoes. But what we have to say is today's medicine, because of the machines, it's more expensive for the hospital than it was before, right? To have a proper hospital. So the cost of medicine also for patients is huge.
See, I don't know if I agree with that. The Charité, where I work in Berlin, has exactly the same budget as the Oxford University hospitals in Oxford. The Charité has 3 times the number of beds. The length of stay is 3 times the length of stay. They provide the same amount of care, much more gently, with much better discharges home than the hospital in Oxford, where people go home the same day. So we're in too much of a hurry in Oxford to get people who we can get out. And the reason we're doing that is because the hospitals are looking after all these patients who are in the wrong place at the wrong time, who should be in social care. Technically, you're right, it is increasingly expensive, but it's increasingly effective. So the stroke treatment that I'm talking about, maybe it costs 20 or 30,000, which is expensive, but each patient we treat is cured and goes home. If we had a treatment that didn't work that maybe costs 5,000, patient stays in the hospital 2 or 3 months, they don't go home.
Maybe people don't have 30,000.
But
So
this is government.
Big problem.
This is government funding. The truth is that the cost of a stroke that you don't treat is 100,000. The cost of treatment, and you get better, 30,000. You only need to treat one person badly compared to 3 that you treat well. This is a false economy. The problem is that medicine is effective and therefore people are not dying. And so then you have the cost of people aging more slowly. And one of my big upsets about COVID was, of course, it was very cost effective for governments because elderly people were dying.
But, we all refer to the American medicine, or at least hospital, because in America there are doctors who are at the Cornell or at the Harvard, but they come from all over the world, right? They're not necessarily American doctors. The institution is American, the hospital is American. But then the nurses, the doctors are probably not American, right? But the big problem is that only a few Americans can afford medicine.
Which is why
the fact that they can afford insurance.
Right.
But most people cannot. And therefore, even if it's very advanced and great, it's only for a few.
So here is the problem. It's been solved in Canada. And it's quite different in Canada, where people essentially have the same access as they have in the English NHS. It's completely open, free at the point of delivery, and the same for all. The problem they've got in Canada is they do not allow private practice. So you can't buy access unless you go to the US. The problem in the UK now is because the wait lists are long and because the access is poor, more and more people are paying for private care because they need it. And that undermines the state's provision of care. And more of my colleagues, more and more of the people that we train are reverting to providing private care.
But they don't want to go to NHS.
Correct. In 1948, when my father was a medical student, this switch to providing care to all absolutely transformed people's expectation of medical care. They were providing care for people with infection, with heart attacks, with needs for surgery. And gradually, the NHS has been providing social care, and it's been diluted from the primary purpose. And the new government have somehow got to get the National Health Service providing health care and not social care.
Are you optimistic?
No, I wish I was.
Thank you.
Powered by Dr. Podcast, your audio factory, turning ideas into a signature sound.